Margaret Holloway stood in the doorway of her tiny rented apartment, holding the worn brown leather suitcase with brass clasps that contained everything she owned in the world. At 74 years old, with silver white hair pulled back in a loose bun and pale blue-gray eyes that still held clarity behind her gold-rimmed glasses, she was a woman diminished by circumstance. The apartment was sparse and impersonal, pale walls that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, minimal furniture that spoke of temporary occupation, a single window facing an alley, where dumpsters and old brick walls were all that could be seen. On the windowsill sat a struggling potted plant, its leaves pale and drooping, the only botanical specimen she had been able to save from her former life. She had always been a woman of gardens, of growing things, of creation and patient cultivation. The green cardigan she wore over a cream blouse hung slightly loosely on her frame, and her khaki trousers were pressed despite their age. Her brown gardening boots, worn at the heels, rested beside the suitcase. Now she was a woman of loss, stripped of everything by betrayal, standing on the threshold of what had become her only possession. 42 years. That was how long Margaret had been married to Harold Holloway, and for most of those decades, she had constructed a life of profound meaning and purpose. She had been a university botanist, respected in her field, known throughout North Carolina's academic community for her meticulous work cataloging the state's native plant species and her innovative teaching methods that made botany come alive for students. Her classes were legendary. Students waited years to enroll in her courses, competing for seats in her lectures, where she spoke about plants with the poetry of someone who truly loved her subject. Colleagues sought her expertise on conservation matters and rare species identification. She had published 18 peer-reviewed papers, mentored dozens of researchers who had gone on to significant careers in botanical science, and spent her life in the tireless pursuit of understanding the intricate language of plants and growth. Harold had been a lawyer, a good man with steady hands and steady principles, or so she had believed during those 4 decades together. They had created a home together, a substantial house surrounded by gardens that Margaret had tended with the same meticulous care she applied to her academic work and her university research. Those gardens were legendary among their friends, carefully curated botanical spaces where rare specimens grew alongside native plants, where every stone and every plant was placed with intentional purpose, where Margaret would spend hours on her knees, hands in soil, coaxing life from the earth. Harold had 2 children from his first marriage. Derek, tall and ambitious, with dark brown slicked hair and calculating hazel eyes that always seemed to be assessing the financial value of whatever he observed, and Catherine, kind but emotionally distant, who had moved to California and rarely visited, creating a life separate from her family of origin. Margaret had accepted them into her life with genuine warmth and without reservation. She had never thought of them as stepchildren, but simply as part of her family, extensions of the life she and Harold were building together. She had attended their graduations, helped with their first apartments, been present at their wedding ceremonies, listened to their problems, and offered counsel when asked. She had especially loved Harold's mother, Eleanor, a gracious woman in her 80s who possessed her own quiet wisdom about life and people, and who had embraced Margaret with immediate affection from the day Harold had first brought her home. Eleanor would visit on weekends, and the 3 of them, Eleanor, Harold, and Margaret, would sit in the gardens, and Eleanor would tell stories about the Holloway family and its history, sharing a kind of gentle approval with Margaret that made her feel truly welcomed into the family. Then Harold died. It was sudden and unexpected, a massive heart attack while he was at his law office on a Tuesday afternoon in March, unexpected and absolutely final. He was 76 years old. Margaret, at 71, found herself transformed from wife to widow in a moment that seemed to split her life into before and after. The grief was immense, a weight that seemed to press down on her constantly, making it difficult to breathe at times, making the mornings feel like they would never end. In those first weeks, the overwhelming sadness was almost a comfort in its totality. It gave her something to hold on to, a clear emotional landscape that matched the external chaos of loss. But gradually, as the initial shock began to fade, she had thought that she would be okay. She had her life, her home, her beloved gardens, her work as a retired academic, still doing consulting. She had her memories and her devotion. She had the life they had built together. Or so she thought. Derek had come to her within days of the funeral, before Harold was even in the ground. He was professional and sympathetic in a way that now seemed calculated, speaking about probate and estate matters in a tone that seemed helpful on the surface, but was clearly designed to establish his authority and control over the process. He had brought his lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia with efficient hands and colder eyes than Derek's own, a woman who spoke in rapid legal terminology and seemed to view Margaret with a mixture of pity and disdain. Together, they had presented documents that showed Harold's will designated Derek and Catherine as executors of his estate, with Margaret simply named as beneficiary. Margaret listened with growing confusion as they explained complications with the estate, debts she had not known existed, complications with the title to the house, issues with the property that required immediate attention and action. They spoke quickly, deliberately, using language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify, building a wall of legal jargon between Margaret and her understanding of her own situation. Derek would interrupt the lawyer to add his own commentary, speaking to Margaret as though she were a child or an elderly person suffering from cognitive decline, simplifying explanations in ways that felt patronizing and deeply disrespectful. It took Margaret several months to understand what had happened, months during which she was too grief-stricken to ask the right questions or to recognize the betrayal occurring in front of her. The house and all its contents were sold to a developer's corporation that Derek had connections to, a sale that seemed to happen at speed, before Margaret could even fully process what was occurring. The proceeds, after Derek's substantial lawyer's fees, after supposed estate debts that Margaret had never verified, after appraisers' costs and administrative expenses, were divided equally between Derek and Catherine. Margaret, as Harold's widow, should have been provided for significantly. The house alone should have been hers, and most of the estate should have passed to her. But somewhere in the legal maneuvering, in the careful manipulation of documents, and the exploitation of her grief, the unthinkable had occurred. Harold, apparently, had changed his will 3 years before his death, during a period when Margaret was away attending an international botanical conference in Geneva, a time when she had been out of the country for 2 weeks and completely unaware of any changes to their legal arrangements. The revised will left everything to Derek and Catherine equally, with no explicit provision for Margaret beyond her right as a widow to claim a statutory share. When Margaret's own lawyer finally reviewed the documents, they presented it as a discovery that surprised everyone. "We didn't know either," Derek had said, his smile never reaching his eyes, creating the fiction of shared surprise. "But the will is quite clear. Father changed it, and it's all legal." Margaret had contacted lawyers of her own, desperate lawyers who came highly recommended, but the will was legal. Harold, they told her, had every right to change it without Margaret's knowledge or consent. There was no prenuptial agreement to protect her interests. She had no legal claim beyond a widow's statutory share, which under North Carolina law was far less than what should have been hers as the spouse of a man she had been married to for 4 decades. She was given approximately $18,000, payment for 42 years of marriage, for a life built with a man she had loved deeply, for decades of companionship and support in the building of a shared existence. The amount was cruel in its inadequacy, but it was what the law allowed, and the courts upheld it. Margaret had wept in her lawyer's office, holding her hands in her lap to hide their shaking, trying to maintain dignity while her life was being systematically dismantled. Derek had been almost kind about it in the months that followed. He had offered to let her stay in the house temporarily while she found alternative housing, an offer that felt generous on the surface, but that Margaret now understood was simply another manipulation. By allowing her to stay briefly, he was establishing the property as his, establishing the narrative that she was a guest in her own home. But after 6 weeks, after he had clearly documented that the house was no longer her residence, he had begun the process of renting out the property and then eventually selling it to developers who would tear down the house and the gardens and replace them with a strip mall. The gardens Margaret had spent decades cultivating, the carefully tended spaces she had created and maintained with her own hands, were destroyed. The bulldozers came on a day when Margaret was in her small apartment, and she did not know it was happening until it was done. Everything that had been hers, every plant she had nurtured, every rose she had tended through seasons, every rare specimen she had coaxed into bloom, was erased, returned to bare earth and destruction. She had retrieved only what she could carry. The brown leather suitcase with brass clasps had belonged to her mother, a woman who had also suffered losses and disappointments in her own life, and Margaret had always kept it as a reminder of resilience and endurance. She had packed it with a few essential clothing items, some photographs of her years with Harold, a handful of books from her office that contained the work she valued most, and a small collection of seeds from her gardens, the last physical remnants of the life she had created, seeds that she had saved from her rarest specimens, tiny vessels of possibility that might someday grow into plants again. The seeds, at least, she could plant somewhere else. Everything else was gone, erased, destroyed, existing now only in memory and in photographs. Now, standing in the doorway of her rented apartment, Margaret looked at her reflection in the small mirror by the door. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. She saw her silver-white hair, still thick, pulled into its familiar loose bun, wisps framing her weathered face, her pale blue-gray eyes behind her gold-rimmed reading glasses still clear and observant, still seeing the world with the careful attention of a trained scientist. But the woman in the mirror looked diminished, displaced, as if she had been erased from her own life. She appeared smaller than she remembered being, more fragile, more uncertain. She was still Margaret Holloway, retired botanist, but she was now Margaret Holloway, with nowhere to grow, nowhere to create, nowhere to belong. A woman whose identity had been built on the creation of living spaces and who now existed in a rented apartment with bare walls and a single dying plant. The months following the loss of everything were the darkest of her life, a period she would later think of as the time when she had lost not just her possessions, but her sense of purpose and identity. She worked occasional consulting jobs for a local botanical garden, identification work and specimen care, just enough to pay her rent and buy groceries, work that was beneath her training and her expertise, but that she was grateful to receive. She spent her evenings in the small apartment, reading old academic journals and books about plants she could no longer cultivate, living vicariously through the research of others, watching the world of botanical science continue without her. She would sometimes stand at the window and watch the alley below, seeing nothing particularly interesting. Dumpsters, old brick, the occasional rat moving through shadows, feeling the weight of her age and her displacement pressing down upon her shoulders like a physical thing. She had lost not just her home, but her role in the world, her status as a respected academic, her identity as a woman of creation and growth, her own biological children, Margaret's children from a previous marriage that had ended in divorce decades earlier when she was in her 30s, were sympathetic but distant in ways that made clear they could not truly understand her situation. They lived in other states, one in Seattle working in technology, one in Chicago with a family and a demanding job, and they had their own lives and responsibilities, their own families that consumed their time and emotional energy. They called occasionally, invited her to visit for holidays, but it was clear that she could not impose herself on their lives, could not expect them to create space for her failures. She did not want to burden them with her problems. She was their mother, but she had failed to secure her own future, had allowed herself to be betrayed, had made choices that had left her vulnerable. That was her failure, not theirs, and she could not ask them to pay the price for her poor judgment. One evening in the early spring, almost a year after losing everything, Margaret received a box delivered to her apartment by a courier service. It was unexpected. She received little mail beyond bills and occasional consulting job inquiries, letters that felt like small lifelines to her former self. The box was medium-sized and unmarked except for her name and address. Inside the box was a collection of items that had belonged to Harold. Some books, including several volumes of poetry he had loved, a few pieces of jewelry, a watch and cufflinks, some old photographs in a manila envelope. They were items that had been stored, apparently in Derek's office, and were now being returned to her as a courtesy. Derek's brief note on corporate letterhead explained that he was moving his office to a different building across town and wanted to clear out the storage area. That was what the note said, though Margaret suspected there might be other reasons Derek was suddenly compelled to return these items to her. Perhaps some sense of conscience, or perhaps the recognition that he had already taken what he most wanted, and these remnants held no value to him. Margaret spent the evening looking through the items with the care and attention she would have given to examining botanical specimens. The photographs brought back memories so vivid that they sometimes made her gasp. Harold as a young man in his 20s, dark-haired and hopeful, before marriage and law school, and the weight of adult responsibility had aged him. The two of them on their wedding day, Margaret in a simple white dress, Harold in a suit, both of them looking at the camera with clear love in their eyes. Harold in his office at the law firm years ago, standing beside a diploma, proud of his professional accomplishments. She held these images as if they were fragile things that might break if she gripped them too tightly, trying to preserve the feeling of those moments, trying to understand how a marriage that had seemed so solid had been so easily dismantled. Then she opened one of the books, an old botany textbook from the university that Harold had kept from her teaching days decades ago. The pages were worn from handling, and it was marked in several places where Harold had made notes about her research in his careful handwriting, small comments and questions that showed he had read her work carefully. Harold had always been interested in her research, had supported her career, even during the years when such support from a spouse was unusual and not expected in their social circles, and these notes were evidence of that long attention. As she carefully turned the pages of the old textbook, moving through chapters on plant classification and cellular structure, a small envelope fell out and onto her lap. The envelope was old, The paper yellowed with age and fragile from decades of storage, and it bore handwriting that Margaret recognized immediately. The elegant script of Eleanor, Harold's mother, a woman known for her beautiful penmanship and her careful attention to detail. Eleanor had died 5 years ago, before Harold, passing away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 92, having seen and experienced much of the 20th century. Margaret opened the envelope carefully, aware that she was holding something old and fragile, something that had been hidden inside a book for what must have been many years. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully and precisely, and inside the fold was what appeared to be a much older envelope sealed with wax, a small time capsule within the larger envelope. On the single page, in Eleanor's beautiful handwriting that Margaret remembered so well from birthday cards and letters received over the years, was a message written in ink that had faded to a pale brown but remained legible. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then Harold and I are no longer with you, and I suspect you will need to understand something that I have kept carefully hidden for nearly 2 decades. Something that I have guarded and protected because I knew that the day might come when you would need its truth more than any living person could provide. The greenhouse keeps what the house cannot. Look beneath where the stone fern grows. You were always my dearest daughter, the one I prayed would be strong enough to inherit what you deserve. Find what is hidden. Trust what you find. Trust in yourself, Margaret. For you are stronger than you know. With all my love and deep belief in your strength, Eleanor. Margaret read the message 3 times before the words truly penetrated her consciousness, before she could begin to understand what Eleanor might mean and what Eleanor might have hidden. The greenhouse. Eleanor had mentioned the old greenhouse at the family property, and the message was clear, written with the precision of someone who wanted to communicate important information in a way that could not be misunderstood. Eleanor had hidden something at the old family property beneath the greenhouse, something that had been protected for decades, waiting. The property where Harold had grown up, the property outside Asheville, North Carolina, where the family had spent summers in Eleanor's younger years. It was a place Margaret had not visited in years. The property had been sold years ago when the estate house was falling into disrepair, and she was not even sure if the property still existed in any recognizable form, given everything that had happened with the estate and with Derek's management of the family assets. She spent the next several days doing research through the property records office, making phone calls to county officials, and sending emails to historical societies and property management companies. Through a combination of old deeds and historical records, through persistence and careful investigation, she discovered something surprising that made her heart begin to race with hope. The land where the family estate had once stood was still partly owned by someone, though it was not Derek, and it was not Harold's estate. The estate house itself had been sold and demolished years ago, the valuable land subdivided and sold to developers, but the back portion of the property, approximately a 1/4 acre, had been left untouched, seemingly forgotten or deemed worthless. It contained the old Victorian-era greenhouse, which was still standing according to the records, though clearly unused and deteriorating from decades of abandonment. The property was currently tax delinquent and designated as abandoned, the kind of property that no one seemed to care about or even remember that it existed, a small remnant of a former era. Margaret made a decision that night, sitting at her kitchen table with the deed records printed out in front of her. She had little to lose and something, perhaps everything, to potentially gain. She would go to the greenhouse. She would find what Eleanor had hidden. She would discover the truth that Eleanor had believed was important enough to protect for nearly 2 decades, hidden carefully inside a book waiting for the moment when Margaret would need it most, waiting for the time when Margaret's faith in the world had been shaken but not destroyed entirely. She packed the brown leather suitcase with brass clasps with a few essential items, changes of clothing, her reading glasses, a flashlight, notebook and pen, made arrangements for her part-time work to pause for 2 weeks, and purchased a bus ticket to Asheville, North Carolina. She had no car, could not afford one on her consulting wages, and the bus was the only practical option for a woman of limited means. She left the struggling potted plant with her downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Chen, and asked her to water it occasionally, explaining that she was going away but might be back soon. Then she left, carrying only the suitcase and a deeply buried sense of hope she had not felt in over a year, a fragile belief that perhaps Eleanor had seen something in the future that Margaret herself could not see. The drive to Asheville took many hours, the long arc of a journey that transformed the landscape gradually as the bus moved through the seasons and through geography. Margaret sat by the window and watched the landscape gradually transform from the urban surroundings of the city to the rolling hills of the Piedmont, and then the dramatic mountain vistas of the Blue Ridge, mountains rising in layers against the sky. She had always loved mountains, had always felt a kind of peace in their presence. There was something about their solidity, their permanence, their ancient presence on the earth that had always soothed her, that had always made her feel that her own small life was part of something much larger and more enduring. The mountains had been here long before she was born and would be here long after she was gone. There was peace in that perspective, peace in the understanding that human drama and human betrayal were ultimately small things measured against geological time. She arrived in Asheville in the late afternoon, the sun beginning to lower itself toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. She took a taxi from the bus station to the property address she had found in the records, directing the driver in a voice that sounded uncertain, even to her own ears, to the location outside the city limits, on rural roads where the forest seemed to press close to the asphalt. As they drove through increasingly rural areas, passing old farmhouses and abandoned vehicles, Margaret felt her heart beating faster with a mixture of hope and fear. The driver seemed confused about the exact location. It was not a commonly traveled road, he explained, gesturing to the overgrown driveway, but eventually, using the property number that Margaret provided, he managed to locate the entrance to the property. Margaret paid the driver and stood alone at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, watching his taillights disappear around a bend in the road until she was absolutely alone in the gathering dusk. Before her was the quarter-acre lot she had read about in the records, and her breath caught in her throat. And there, surrounded by thick, untamed boxwood hedges and old magnolia trees that had grown to enormous proportions over decades of neglect, was the greenhouse. It was exactly as she remembered it from visits years ago, but worse, much worse, completely deteriorated and overgrown, nature reclaiming human construction with patient persistence. The Victorian-era wrought iron frame was still standing, its elegant geometry still visible despite the devastation, but the glass panes were shattered and clouded, covered in thick layers of Virginia creeper and wild wisteria vines that had essentially buried the structure, creating a green tomb of vegetation. The plants had completely enveloped the frame, transforming it from a human construction into something almost organic, a hybrid of metal and growth. The door hung on one rusted hinge, barely attached to the frame, swaying slightly in the late afternoon breeze, creaking with a sound of suffering metal. Margaret pulled her brown leather suitcase to the foot of the greenhouse and stood for a moment, gathering her courage, feeling the weight of decades pressing on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool mountain air filling her lungs, and then she walked toward the structure. Her worn brown leather gardening boots crunched on gravel and scattered stones, making sounds that seemed loud in the quiet of the forest. She could smell the earth beneath the overgrowth, rich, damp, ancient, the smell of soil and decomposition and growth. She could smell moss and decay and the green growing things, all mingled together in a complex sensory symphony. It was the smell of a living ecosystem that had been given time and freedom to establish itself undisturbed, the smell of nature in its most honest form, without the ordering hand of human gardeners. She reached for the greenhouse door and pushed it open. It groaned, rust scraping against metal in a sound that was almost a cry of pain, resisting the disturbance after decades of undisturbed rest. The door moved slowly, heavily, resisting centuries of neglect and oxidation, and finally opened far enough that she could step inside. The interior was dim and cool, filtered light coming through the damaged glass ceiling and the vines covering the structure, creating a twilight environment. Her eyes took a moment to adjust to the dimness, to accustom themselves to the reduction in light after the brightness of the outdoor world. The interior was a landscape of abandonment, a museum of decay and the passage of time. Cracked terracotta pots were scattered across the moss-covered stone floor, in arrangements that suggested they had fallen and broken years ago. Collapsed wooden plant tables lay at angles, broken and decaying, their wood soft with rot. Debris was everywhere, fallen glass from the broken panes, dried leaves accumulated over decades, tangles of vines growing unchecked through the structure, creating a maze of vegetation. But underneath the decay and abandonment, underneath the visible deterioration, Margaret could sense something else in the very atmosphere. This had been a place of creation once, a place where intention had been manifest. She could feel it in the very air, in the lingering sense of purpose. This had been a place where plants had grown, where Eleanor or someone before her had tended carefully to botanical specimens, coaxing life and growth from seeds and cuttings. She could almost see the ghosts of what it had been, could almost hear the sounds of water and growth that would have filled this space when it was alive and tended. She moved deeper into the greenhouse, her eyes adjusting further to the dimness, her hands reaching out to steady herself as she navigated through decades of accumulated debris. She was looking for something specific, a stone fern, Eleanor had written. The wording suggested a marker, something deliberate and intentional carved into stone. Looking at the floor, she began to notice the stones beneath the moss and debris. The greenhouse had a stone floor, probably installed when it was first built more than 100 years ago, set into the earth with mortar long since dried and cracked. Many of the stones were worn and covered with moss so thick it was like velvet, but some stones had features that distinguished them. Designs carved into them with deliberate precision, patterns that suggested they were decorative rather than purely functional. Stones that had been crafted with intention by someone who valued beauty, even in practical construction. Near the back wall of the greenhouse, Margaret found what she was looking for. One of the raised flagstones had a delicate carving of a fern frond on its surface, a botanical image rendered in stone with remarkable precision and artistry. The carving was beautiful and exact, showing the intricate veining of the fern leaf, each small pinule carefully depicted, demonstrating knowledge of botanical form and an artist's skill. She could tell that this stone had been deliberately crafted, placed here with intention and purpose. This was a marker, a signal meant for someone who would understand its meaning, someone who loved plants enough to recognize a fern when they saw it. Eleanor had left a message carved in stone waiting for Margaret. Margaret knelt beside the stone, her thin hands trembling slightly as she did so, feeling the cold, damp stone beneath her knees. She used a piece of broken glass and a stick to work at the edges of the flagstone, trying to loosen it from its centuries-old position, working carefully to avoid cutting her hands on the sharp glass. It was difficult work, slow and frustrating. The stone had settled into place over more than 100 years, surrounded by earth and moss and the weight of other stones, held down by its own weight and the accumulated weight of time. Margaret worked patiently, however, drawing on the discipline and patience she had learned over a lifetime of working with plants, of waiting for growth to occur at nature's own pace, of understanding that some things could not be rushed. She worked for nearly an hour, carefully working around the edges of the stone, gradually loosening it, working the edges free, feeling the stone begin to shift almost imperceptibly. Finally, with a deep breath and a final push of effort from legs that protested with pain, the stone lifted. It was heavier than she expected, dense and solid, and she nearly dropped it as she lifted it aside. Beneath it was a cavity, a carefully constructed hollow space that had been covered and protected, designed to be hidden and remain hidden, unless someone deliberately looked for it and knew how to find it. And inside that space, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and sealed with layers of wax, was a metal box. The box was rectangular, about the size of a jewelry box but heavier, made of what appeared to be tarnished copper or brass, with intricate Victorian-era engraving on its surface depicting botanical motifs, flowers and leaves and vines rendered in decorative style. It was old, genuinely old, but it had been carefully sealed and protected, and Margaret could tell that whatever was inside had been preserved with care and intention. Margaret lifted the box out of the cavity with both hands, feeling its weight settle into her arms. It was heavier than she expected, solid and real and undeniable. She sat back on her heels on the moss-covered stone floor and carefully examined the box, turning it to see the engraving in the dimming light filtering through the greenhouse glass. The wax seals were still intact, showing no signs of tampering or disturbance. This box had been hidden here for decades, waiting, untouched, exactly as Eleanor had left it. Eleanor had known. Eleanor had placed this here, or had arranged for it to be placed here, with the intention that Margaret would eventually find it, would understand Eleanor's message, would discover what had been hidden and protected all this time. Margaret broke the wax seals carefully, working slowly and deliberately, trying not to damage the documents inside. Inside the box was oilcloth wrapping, yellowed and brittle but still intact, which she unwrapped with trembling hands. Inside the wrapping was a collection of documents, carefully preserved and protected from the elements, documents that had survived for decades in darkness. The documents were old, dating back to 1985, and they were written on heavy parchment stock that felt substantial and permanent. At the top of the stack was a deed, a legitimate property deed, signed and notarized, official and legal. The deed was for a parcel of 40 acres of lakefront land located in the mountains outside Asheville. The land was listed as being purchased in 1985 by Eleanor Holloway, and the current owner, according to the deed, was Margaret Holloway, placed in her name and in a trust designated for her benefit. Margaret sat in silence on the stone floor of the abandoned greenhouse, holding the deed in her trembling hands, feeling the weight of the parchment and what it meant. 40 acres, lakefront property, in her name. This was not in Harold's estate. This was not something that Derek had access to or could claim. This was something that Eleanor had arranged, something that Eleanor had planned and executed with deliberation, something that Eleanor had hidden and protected and reserved specifically for Margaret, specifically for a moment just like this one when Margaret would need it most. Beneath the deed was a letter, written in Eleanor's elegant handwriting, the same handwriting that was on the envelope, preserved carefully. Margaret unfolded it with great care and read it by the filtered light coming through the greenhouse's broken glass ceiling, sitting on the cold stone floor, surrounded by decades of abandonment. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this letter, I have passed from this world, and so likely has Harold. I want you to know that I have always seen you clearly, Margaret, perhaps more clearly than anyone else has ever seen you. I saw how you loved my son, how you created beauty in every place you touched, how you gave your entire heart to a life of growth and creation. I also saw Derek's true nature long before Harold was willing to acknowledge it, long before Harold could admit to himself what his son truly was. Derek is driven by avarice and the desire to dominate, by a need to accumulate and control that goes beyond normal ambition. He will betray everyone around him, including his own father, if he perceives it serves his interests. I knew that Harold would not acknowledge this truth in his lifetime, but I also knew that Derek would eventually act on his nature, that his true self would eventually be revealed. When that happened, I wanted you to be protected, to have something that no one could take from you. In 1985, I purchased this property. 40 acres of beautiful lakefront land in the mountains I have always loved so much. I placed the deed in your name, creating a separate trust to hold the property in your sole ownership. I did this not because I doubted my son, but because I doubted my son's son, and what his ambitions might lead him to do to the woman Harold loves. I wanted to know that no matter what happened, you would be taken care of. You would have something that could not be taken from you, something that was irrevocably yours. You would have a place to create, to grow, to build a life that was yours alone, entirely separate from Harold's estate and from Derek's control. I am trusting that this letter finds you after disappointment and loss. I know you well enough to sense that by the time you read these words, Derek has revealed his true nature, and you have suffered greatly for it. I sense that the pain will be profound, and that you will question everything you believe to be true. I am deeply sorry for the loss and the pain you have endured, but I want you to know that the loss Harold inflicted upon you does not define your worth. You were always valued by me. You were always seen and cherished. You were always my true daughter, the daughter I chose and embraced. This property is my gift to you, not because you need rescuing, but because you deserve to have something that is entirely your own, something that no one can take from you, something that reflects the truth of your worth and your importance to me. Use it to create again. Use it to grow again. Build the life you deserve to live. Live well, Margaret. Grow, create, and remember that you are deeply loved by someone who truly saw you. Eleanor, who always loved you as a true daughter. Margaret sat in the greenhouse and wept, her tears falling silently onto the ancient stone floor, her entire body shaking with the force of emotion released. She wept for the betrayal, for the profound sense of having been seen through and used, for the loss of the life she had believed she was building, for the years of sacrifice that had been so carelessly discarded by people she had loved and trusted. She wept for Harold, who had somehow allowed Derek to manipulate him into changing his will, or who had perhaps agreed to the changes without fully understanding what would happen, who had taken the decision about Margaret's future into his own hands without consulting her. She wept for the unfairness of it, for the legal system that had protected Harold's right to disinherit his wife of 4 decades. But she also wept for Eleanor, who had loved her enough to protect her in secret, who had seen the truth about Derek years before the betrayal occurred, who had arranged for redemption without needing Margaret to know about it beforehand, without needing Margaret to suffer gratitude in advance. Eleanor had believed in Margaret's strength in a way that no one else had ever believed in her. Eleanor had trusted that Margaret would endure the worst that could happen and would eventually find her way to this place and this truth. Eleanor's love had waited across decades, hidden beneath stone and earth, patient and enduring, growing stronger with time rather than weaker. She sat there as the afternoon light shifted and changed, moving through the broken glass of the greenhouse, creating patterns on the stone floor, creating geometric designs of light and shadow. She sat there as the weight of the past year began to shift and change in her understanding. The injustice was still real, the betrayal still real, the loss still profound and genuine. But Eleanor's love was also real. Eleanor's faith in her was real. Eleanor had seen her and had acted to protect her, had known that protection might be needed, and had prepared for it with care and deliberation. When Margaret finally stood up, her knees were stiff from kneeling on the cold stone for so long, and she had to steady herself with one hand against the greenhouse frame. She carefully placed the deed and Eleanor's letter back in the metal box and sealed it again with care, wrapping it in the oilcloth and holding it close to her chest. She picked up her brown leather suitcase with brass clasps and walked out of the greenhouse into the fading afternoon light. The trees around the property seemed to glow golden in the slanting sun, transformed by the angle of light. The mountains in the distance were beautiful and eternal, unchanged by human drama, permanent and solid against the changing sky. The next weeks were spent in legal proceedings and verification, a process that required Margaret's attention and emotional energy, but that also gave her something to do, something to focus on beyond her grief and her disbelief. Margaret hired a lawyer in Asheville, a woman named Judith who specialized in property law and who listened to Margaret's story with genuine compassion and understanding. Margaret showed her the deed and Eleanor's letter, watching the lawyer's face as she carefully read the documents, seeing the moment when the lawyer fully understood the significance of what she was seeing and what it meant. The lawyer spent hours verifying that the property was legitimate, that the deed was properly recorded decades ago in Margaret's name, that Eleanor had followed all the proper procedures. The deed predated Harold's death by many years, by 3 decades in fact. Purchased in 1985 when Eleanor was in her 70s, it was entirely separate from Harold's estate, registered in Margaret's name alone in a trust that Eleanor had established, with no connection to any family assets or to Harold's will. The property had been taken out of the normal flow of estate matters and protected by Eleanor's careful legal planning. Derek had no claim to it whatsoever, legally or morally, no matter how he tried to argue that it should be considered part of the family estate. The property, valued by professional appraisers at several $1 million in development rights and as pristine lakefront real estate in a desirable mountain location, belonged entirely to Margaret. Judith smiled when she told Margaret this, a genuine smile that reflected her relief and her understanding that Margaret had been vindicated despite what had seemed like absolute loss. Derek challenged the deed, of course, his actions revealing the truth of Eleanor's predictions about his character. His lawyer, the same sharp woman Patricia who had handled the estate matters, sent letters claiming that the property should be considered part of Harold's estate as a community asset, that Eleanor's actions were questionable and perhaps indicative of diminished capacity in her later years, that the deed should be declared invalid and the property should be redistributed according to the terms of Harold's will. Derek claimed that Eleanor's decision to give Margaret the property was evidence of favoritism and unfair treatment of his own interests. The letters were aggressive and threatening, written in a way that seemed designed to intimidate Margaret and make her believe that the deed might not actually be valid. Margaret's hands would shake when she read Derek's letters, as she recognized again the betrayal that lay at the heart of his actions. But Margaret's lawyer, Judith, was experienced in these matters and had seen similar cases before, cases where children tried to overturn gifts given by parents to spouses they did not like. The documentation was clear and unambiguous. Eleanor's actions, though unusual and protective in intent, were entirely legal and documented properly, with all the necessary signatures and notarization. The property had been purchased with Eleanor's own funds from her separate inheritance, had been placed in Margaret's name with proper legal procedures that Eleanor had arranged with her own lawyer, and was held in a trust specifically established for Margaret's benefit and protected from any claims by Harold's estate. The property was irrevocably Margaret's, and no court would rule otherwise. Judith's confidence was steady and calming, a counterweight to Margaret's lingering uncertainty. Within 2 months, after the legal challenges had been resolved and Derek's repeated attempts to overturn the deed had been exhausted through the legal system, Margaret walked the 40-acre property that was now hers. She spent an entire day walking every inch of it, moving through the overgrown areas and the more accessible spaces, beginning to understand what she had been given. She stood on the lakefront in the afternoon, watching the water reflect the mountains beyond, watching the late afternoon light paint everything in shades of gold and blue, painting the world in colors that seemed almost impossible in their beauty. She could see the water lapping gently at the shore, could hear the sounds of birds calling from the trees, could feel the cool mountain air on her face. She stood there for a long time, just breathing, just feeling the reality of ownership and possibility settle into her bones. She envisioned what she could create here, the gardens she could build, the educational spaces she could establish, the life she could construct from the wreckage of her previous life. She thought about Eleanor, who had known all along that this day would come, who had trusted that Margaret would find the strength to move forward, who had believed in Margaret's capacity to survive and thrive, even when Margaret herself could not believe it. Eleanor had given her not just property, but redemption, not just financial security, but validation that she had been seen and valued. The greenhouse, the Victorian-era structure that Eleanor had hidden her love beneath, that had been the carrier of Eleanor's message and her protection, Margaret had it carefully dismantled and restored over the course of months by skilled craftspeople she found through a regional preservation society. The restoration was painstaking and consumed a significant portion of Margaret's newfound resources, but Margaret knew it was profoundly important to preserve this structure, this symbol of Eleanor's love and foresight. The work of restoration became a kind of meditation for Margaret as she consulted with the craftspeople and made decisions about materials and design. She had the glass panes restored using period-appropriate materials that matched the original as closely as possible. The wrought iron frame carefully painted with a soft sage green that complemented the surrounding landscape and reinforced where rust had weakened the metal, and the interior completely cleaned and prepared for a new purpose. The restoration took longer than expected and cost more than initially budgeted, but each problem solved, each panel of glass carefully installed, each section of frame brought back to its original integrity, felt like a conversation with Eleanor, a dialogue across time about what mattered and what was worth preserving. The greenhouse was then transported carefully to her new property by specialized movers and reconstructed in a position overlooking the lake, positioned so that it would catch light throughout the day, from morning sunrise through afternoon glow, so that it would be a visible testament to Eleanor's faith and protection, so that it would become the heart of everything Margaret would build on this property. Margaret created a botanical education space inside the greenhouse, a place where knowledge could be shared and where growth could be nurtured. She began teaching workshops for local children and interested adults, teaching them about native plants and their ecological relationships, about the intricacy of botanical systems, about the patience and care required to create living, growing spaces. She built gardens around the greenhouse, carefully curated gardens that reflected her decades of knowledge and her vision of what could grow in the North Carolina mountains, gardens that became known throughout the region for their beauty and ecological sophistication. She built a cottage for herself on the property, a small house with large windows facing the lake and the gardens, a place that was hers alone. She furnished it simply with books and plants, surrounding herself with the things that brought her joy and meaning. And she began the slow process of rebuilding her life, not by trying to recreate what had been lost, but by building something new and different that was entirely hers. She was no longer a university professor, no longer had the status and respect of academic credentials, but she was still a botanist. She was still a creator. She still had knowledge to share and growth to cultivate. A year after finding the deed, Margaret stood in her restored greenhouse, surrounded by thriving botanical specimens from her painstakingly created gardens, with sunlight streaming through the clear glass ceiling and casting golden light across her weathered face. She was watering a collection of native plants, ferns and wildflowers, orchids and rare specimens that she had carefully cultivated from seed, including plants grown from the seeds she had saved from her original gardens decades ago, seeds she had carried in the brown suitcase, seeds that had been waiting for the right place to grow. Her hands, still thin and still marked with permanent soil stains from decades of working in earth, moved with the same care and precision that had always characterized her work, muscle memory and knowledge flowing through her as naturally as breathing. The plants responded to her care, grew under her attention, thrived in the space she had created for them. She had moved beyond the bitterness of betrayal and had found something deeper and more sustaining. Not forgiveness of Derek exactly, not reconciliation with Harold's memory, but a kind of peace with what had happened and with what had been revealed about the world and about human nature. She understood now that Eleanor had seen something true about Derek, had known him in a way that Harold never would, and had taken action based on that knowledge. She thought about Eleanor, who had loved her enough to protect her in secret, who had seen her worth even when Margaret herself had forgotten it. She thought about the unfairness of losing 4 decades of marriage, of being erased from her own life by betrayal and greed. But she also thought about the fact that Eleanor's love had endured beyond death. Eleanor's vision had manifested in this property, in this greenhouse, in the chance to rebuild a life that was entirely her own. A life built on her own terms and her own values, rather than on the expectations of others. Margaret had learned during those years of rebuilding that justice does not always come quickly or in the ways we expect, that it does not always arrive through the legal system or through confrontation with those who have wronged us. Sometimes, justice is hidden beneath moss-covered stones for decades, waiting patiently and silently for the person it is meant to protect to arrive and discover it in their moment of greatest need. Sometimes love is expressed not through grand gestures or public declarations, but through quiet, patient, secret protection that spans years and decades, through actions taken in private that only bear fruit long after the person who took them has passed from the world. Sometimes redemption arrives not as rescue by another person swooping in to save the day, but as the revelation that you were always valued, always seen, always worthy of being protected and provided for, that someone who loved you had enough faith in your strength to let you suffer temporarily, knowing that you would ultimately survive and flourish. Margaret understood now that Eleanor's gift was not just the property or the financial security it provided, but the knowledge that she had never been as abandoned as she had felt, that someone had always believed in her. Derek had attempted to challenge the property deed several more times over the following years, filing lawsuits and hiring increasingly expensive lawyers, becoming more desperate as each challenge was dismissed by the courts. With each failed attempt, he accumulated more legal fees that he had to pay from his own resources, money that was no longer funding his lifestyle and his ambitions. His challenges eventually stopped, not because he suddenly accepted the truth, but because he had exhausted his legal options and his appetite for expensive, losing battles. He went on with his life, presumably still unaware of the full irony of his situation, still unaware that the woman he had betrayed and believed he had destroyed had, in fact, been protected all along by the person he loved most, his own mother. Eleanor had known her son well enough to predict his behavior, well enough to know that he would eventually betray and exploit Margaret, and had taken action to protect Margaret from that very exploitation. Margaret did not seek Derek out or inform him of this truth. She did not feel compelled to tell him what Eleanor had done, what Eleanor had known, or how completely Eleanor had seen through him. She did not need to. She had moved beyond the space where Derek's actions had power over her, beyond the space where his betrayal could define her or determine her future. Years passed in a gentle progression of seasons and growth, and Margaret's botanical education program became known throughout the region and eventually beyond its borders. Students and teachers came to her workshops from hours away, traveling across mountain roads to learn from her, to experience her teaching that combined scientific rigor with a poet's appreciation for the beauty of natural forms. Universities and schools throughout the Southeast invited her to speak about botanical conservation and restoration, inviting her back year after year, recognizing that her knowledge and her perspective were valuable contributions to the field. Her gardens became legendary among botanists and horticulturalists, known for their beauty and their careful cultivation of rare native species, known as a place where rigorous science and artistic vision and ecological responsibility came together in perfect balance. She published several papers on Appalachian botany and plant conservation in peer-reviewed journals, working again as a scholar in her field, though now as an independent researcher rather than as an academic, bound by institutional constraints and departmental politics. She was respected in her field once more, valued for her knowledge and her contributions, invited to serve on conservation boards and advisory committees. Her work began to influence regional policy about land protection and botanical preservation, influence that would outlast her lifetime and continue to have impact for generations to come. But the greatest gift was not the property or the financial security it provided. The greatest gift was the knowledge that she had been seen. Eleanor had known the truth about Derek, had known the danger he represented, and had acted to protect the woman she loved like a daughter. That love, expressed through this hidden deed and Eleanor's letter, sustained Margaret through the hardest years of her life and validated her sense of her own worth. On the day of the first botanical symposium held at her lake property, an event that brought together botanists from across the region to discuss conservation and restoration strategies, an event that would become an annual tradition, drawing researchers from universities across the Southeast. Margaret stood in her restored greenhouse and felt a profound sense of peace settle over her like a tangible presence. She was 76 years old now, the same age Harold had been when he died, standing in the exact year when she could truly claim to have survived and thrived rather than merely endured. She had been stripped of everything she had built through 42 years of marriage, had lost her home and her gardens and her role in the academic world, but she had also been given something precious that could not have been purchased with money: a second chance, a restored purpose, and the unwavering knowledge that she had been loved and protected all along by someone who had seen clearly, that someone had believed in her strength even when she had forgotten it herself, that her worth had been recognized and valued in the most concrete way possible. The greenhouse, the simple structure that Eleanor had chosen to hide her love beneath, the Victorian-era frame that had carried Eleanor's message across decades, had become the center of Margaret's rebuilt life. It was where she worked, where she taught, where she cultivated growth in all its forms. It was a testament to Eleanor's faith in her strength and to Margaret's own resilience. It was proof that sometimes love is patient enough to wait decades to reveal itself, and that true justice, though it may be delayed, is worth discovering. As Margaret moved through her greenhouse, tending to her plants with the familiar movements of someone doing what they were born to do, greeting her students with warmth and encouragement, and sharing her knowledge with the next generation of botanists and lovers of nature, she thought about the words Eleanor had written. "Live well, Margaret. Grow, create, and remember that you are deeply loved." She had followed those instructions exactly. She had grown not just as a botanist, but as a person who understood her own value. She had created, building gardens and establishing education programs and writing research that would benefit others. And she had finally come to understand and deeply feel that she was and had always been truly loved, not because of what she had done or what she had given to others, but simply because she was Margaret, a woman of wisdom and beauty and strength, a woman worthy of being protected and cherished.